Welcome to another episode of the Close.io Women in Sales series. In this episode, the theme is diversity and inclusion, which has kind of become a buzzword these days and a topic that I had a lot of questions about. What we discuss is basically how to ensure that diversity and inclusion is not just a vanity metric in your organization and not just a photo op, but it's something that really adds value and makes people feel more productive and actually be more productive and thrive. The idea of inclusivity throughout the entire employee life cycle. So think about all the investments that you might be making right now to hiring diverse and amazing talent right at the top of your recruiting pipeline. For somebody to feel like they are included and they are welcome right at the beginning of the interview cycle is great, but they need to actually start there on the first day of the job to the very last day of the job and feel that same way. How to bring up biases in the workplace and to point them out, but not in a finger pointing way. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Here we go. Hey everyone, this is Rebecca at Close.io bringing you our interview series featuring women in sales, where we find out how they grow and thrive both personally and professionally. And in this episode, I'm speaking with Zainab Allawala.
Hi everyone. Like Rebecca said, I'm Zainab Allawala. I'm a customer success account executive at Help Scout. For those of you who don't know, Help Scout is a customer success platform. So we're trying to connect businesses with their customers to help them answer questions and deliver great customer service.
Zainab worked as a strategic account executive at SurveyMonkey and as an SMB account executive at Asana. She's also worked on the Kiva.org fellowship program and also as a recruiting coordinator at Facebook and Google. We love all the tools that you've worked for in the past, in the tech community. Those are huge brand names and iconic names. Thank you so much for being here. You did your education at UC Berkeley and obtained your bachelor's in political sciences. And during that time, you took part in the Association for Muslim Professional Development. So, can you speak to what interests kind of drew you to those things in relation to the theme and topic of today's episode, which is diversity and inclusion?
Yes. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here. So my work or studying political science at UC Berkeley, will start there. UC Berkeley is a hotbed of political activity. It has a great legacy of civil rights. So that's what drew me to the school in general. Political science, I just love to figure out what makes people tick. So kind of the psychology of people. So in the political science realm, figuring out how do people vote and why do they vote in a certain way? What does the breakdown look like in the US or in different countries? So I was just really interested in what makes people tick. I wasn't sure how that would relate to my career, but in sales, it ended up being pretty closely tied. Still trying to figure out how people think, what motivates them, all those sorts of things. And then the Association for Muslim Professional Development is personally something that I really love. So I am a Muslim American. So I grew up Muslim and kind of having that lens on things. I always did things that were a little different than those around me with religious practices. I looked a little bit differently than those around me. And I found that it kind of changed the way that I navigated in college, navigated interviewing, figuring out my career path. And that's what really drew me to that organization in particular. I wanted to help folks in my community feel empowered and kind of help them find opportunities to grow and develop in a professional manner.
So, when you say that you are and you were interested in understanding what makes people tick, what exactly do you mean by that?
I think every decision people make are super interesting. So thinking about the sales process and why certain maybe verbiage gets someone to respond to me, or when I'm talking to them about a product,
Mhm.
talking to different personality types to say like, this is a message that would resonate with someone who's really introverted or maybe someone who's really technical. How do I talk to them? And kind of navigating those scenarios, that's like, it's nerdy, but that's how I get my kicks in my day to be like, I navigated that conversation really well because I took the time to understand that person.
Right. Navigating the conversation is key because just off mic before we started this episode, we were talking about how there's a lot of bad experiences from a lot of users and purchasers out there that speak to salespeople that don't navigate and they kind of bulldoze and this way of speaking at people rather than talking with them and having a conversation with them.
Totally, and that's, like, kind of missing or that, like, empathy from salespeople, like, when I meet when we were talking off mic, I was like, "Wow, you're like me." So there
Yes.
are us empathetic salespeople out there and kind of getting people to understand that we just wanna find a solution that makes sense for you. Consultative sale is not just a buzzword, like, we really wanna figure out if there's a good fit here, so
Yeah.
figuring out how to communicate with different people.
Yeah, we clicked instantly when you were like, "Oh, so many people are worried about being bamboozled," and then I have to tell them like, "Don't worry, that's not going to happen." And I feel the same way as well. And what a privilege to be in that position to give people better sales experiences.
And to work at companies who really promote that. That's something I love about Help Scout. The whole sales environment is really tailored around helping people. Like they walk the talk.
Amazing. I know that you mentioned that, at the time you didn't really think or know that your degree in poli-sci was going to translate into your career the way that it did. But I guess to take a strategic or career kind of lens on this, how do you think that academic influenced you or helped you just through recruiting itself and getting qualified candidates? And then you had spoken about this on the sales and customer level as well, but just overall in business, where do you think the most interesting intersection or translation of that knowledge lies?
Yeah, I think it translates pretty clearly for me in terms of like for political science, you're thinking about governments. But governments are made up of people. Voting blocks are made up of people, and ultimately, like a lot of what I learned was like kind of figuring out the psychology of people. So whether it be recruiting or sales, I think both of those career paths are actually pretty similar if you think about it. You're sourcing either candidates or leads, and you're trying to close them. So really understanding kind of a epiphany moment for me in recruiting was that closing piece of things once a candidate has gone through the process. And then I live in San Francisco, so this whole it's very competitive for candidates here. So that final conversation or few conversations with a candidate to say, why should you take this job? What are the things that are really important to you? You want to move, if you need to move to San Francisco, does that affect your spouse, your children? Kind of taking that extra layer to genuinely be curious to figure out like what is it going to make, what is going to take to for them to take this job. And I think that applies to sales too. When you're really taking a moment to be like, yes, I'm here to talk about the product, but more so I'm here to talk about you and figure out what you need and what it takes to line our solution up with what you need and getting people to understand that. So I think the psychology of folks just it in our field, whether it's recruiting or sales, it pretty directly like correlates.
You just mentioned that something that I don't think about a lot, and I think a lot of us don't realize, but like when you are recruiting somebody, you're not just asking them to make a career decision, you're asking them to make a life decision. And when you're selling SaaS or enterprise software, it's a life decision, maybe not about you personally, although it certainly can be, but it's like if the business were a person, it's like almost like buying a mortgage or a house for that human slash business.
That is so true. And thinking about both of the business, how it will impact them, it might be a big financial decision, but
Totally.
even thinking about the decision maker and thinking like this is going to affect them. So how can I make them look good or make sure they have all the information to make a really good decision? Because they're going to have to live with it. Like, Mark, you made this decision. Like, were you fully informed? So there are real people, even with SaaS, like it's always human interaction and there's a human touch and it affects a real life, either a person or a business at the end of the day.
So when we had gotten together and talked about doing this episode together, I always say to my guests, "Listen, I'm going to come up with a show agenda, and we're gonna go from there. And I'm going to do it based off what I see on your LinkedIn. But like, tell me what you want to talk about. What is something you are personally interested and passionate about? And it can be work related or totally not work related. And you said that you wanted to talk about diversity and inclusion. So why did you want to talk about this topic? And basically, why is diversity and inclusion an important topic that should be discussed?
I think that diversity and inclusion is such a buzzword right now, and a lot of people are talking about it. But
Yes.
I feel like I've lived it, and it truly is something that I'm passionate about.
Mm.
I didn't think about it so much moving into the early parts of my career, but I think moving into sales made me really think about diversity and inclusion. On a lot of levels, I would look around the room and think, wow, I'm the only woman in this room. I'm the only person of color in this room. And it was just this weight I felt. And kind of networking, learning more about diversity and inclusion has made me feel more comfortable. And it's something that I want to like empower other people too. I think it's so important.
So, one of the things that I guess a lack of conscientiousness around diversity and inclusion, comes with is biases. And you mentioned two awesome resources. There is a book called Whistling Vivaldi: How Stereotypes Affect Us and What We Can Do, Issues of Our Time. And there's also a guide. It's Google's Rework Guide on Unbiasing. So, what are some of the biases in the workplace and how can we manage them individually? Let's start individually and then maybe we can expand out into a team basis.
Yeah, so we all have biases, and that's a lot of what Google's work is around. It's a resource I would really recommend. It's around unconscious bias, and we all have it because that's the way our brains are wired. We want to create shortcuts to kind of process things. So as soon as we meet someone, whether we want to or not, we're implicitly making judgments on them. Are they warm? Are they competent? And we try to create these patterns in our minds and try to match people up to those patterns. Unconscious bias is so important because if someone, you interview someone and they don't fit the pattern in your mind, you're like, will they be able to make the jump? I don't know. So on an individual level, like there's nothing wrong with having biases, but I feel it's all of our personal responsibility to try to understand those biases. So what are the things, that I'm judging people on, and kind of taking a really active role in figuring out what those things are, and then trying to figure out like what's the data here, and where can I be objective and where can I kind of take out some of my subjective opinions there. I was reading through the Google, the work they've done one more time, and they were like, people have a tendency to think that sort of the judgment call they made is correct, but the statistics don't always match or usually don't match up with that. So it's always kind of like on gut feelings, not so much on data. So on individual level, just trying to understand your biases and being sort of conscious of them, I think that's a great first step.
So, what if I am aware of my own biases and I see them in others in a group setting? And like, how do I point that out or not so much call people out, but just mention that, it's something that I feel as though we're not addressing? Is there, can you give us a framework or some guidelines on how to bring these things up in a productive kind of fashion?
Yeah, I think the first thing companies or groups should do is have some sort of education on unconscious bias.
Mm,
Because I think talking about it without a framework of education, it can feel like finger pointing. But when you think about it,
right,
like anyone has biases. I have biases, you have biases. And if
right.
it feels like we're kind of in it together, it feels less like finger pointing and more like, okay, I have my own things I'm dealing with. This is something I noticed about you. Have you even thought about it before? And kind of opening up that conversation. Um,
Right,
and
like, let's just all figure this out together.
yeah, versus being like, I mean, it's unconscious. So we can't, I think the only time we can kind of hold someone to it is if they know they're doing that and they're not trying to change their behavior. But a lot of times folks just don't know. So I think education, and kind of accepting this framework and being like, this is something really important. We have trainings on all kinds of things when we start at work. I wish that we could all start with an unconscious bias training too.
Another great resource that you've recommended, and we will include all these resources in the show notes, is Project Include. Can you tell us about the inclusiveness throughout the entire employee life cycle? So, not just at the beginning of the recruiting cycle, which, by the way, when you had pointed that out, I was like, this is something I have never that has never occurred to me. And like, well, duh, it is totally sensible and it's so simple.
It really is simple. So Project Include is wonderful. It was started by Ellen Pao, who was the former CEO of Reddit. She was a partner at Kleiner and does a lot
Mm.
of great work in the space of diversity because she has lived it. So she is one of my sheroes for sure. So would encourage everyone to check out Project Include. But thinking about the employee life cycle, a lot of times resources, like you said, they're poured into a transparent hiring process, which is great. That is the first step. Like an inclusive and transparent hiring process is really important. But then once you're there on day one at your job, kind of retaining those employees that you work so hard to get, I think is really important. So making onboarding something that's ongoing, like throughout the whole first year, is something that Ellen Powell and the whole organization recommends. Aside from that, thinking about things like employee resource groups, that's something that was new to me when I worked at Asana. We had a group called Gradient, and it was for people of color. And within my first 2 weeks, I was invited to speak about my experience fasting in Ramadan. And I felt so included, and to have folks around me in this group, whether they were people of color or allies, just having that space, I was like, "What? This is new and great." And at Help Scout, we're a fully remote company, but we still have ERGs on Slack. So we have like a Who Run the World Slack channel for women. And in moments where I'm unsure of how I maybe navigated a situation, or someone said something that I wasn't sure, was it gender? Was there some gender bias there? How do I call them out? Kind of what you were asking. I can turn to the folks in that group, and it makes a huge difference. Like,
Yes.
feeling supported at work is so important, and it's so simple. Like you were saying, it's natural and it should be happening, but really making an effort. So I think ERG, so those employee resource groups, are great. Um, Another thing with groups, people from smaller groups or disadvantaged groups, they don't always have the same network, or, that's something like why I worked at the Association for Muslim Professional Development, because networking and all that type of stuff is so important at work. So I think having a program for sponsorship or mentorship, that can be really powerful. So it's more than diversity and inclusion. To me, is so much more than a number. Metrics are important for sure, but they don't tell the whole story. So if half your workforce are women, that's great. But if they're a group of women who don't feel supported, what's the point? Or if you don't retain them, I don't think there's much value to that number. So really making it a holistic, this isn't a one-shot thing, it's a living, breathing thing. Diversity and inclusion is something that we think about every day for as long as you stay at the company.
Yeah, and at Close.io, we're also a fully remote company, and our amazing chief of staff, Mary Hartberg, started a Slack channel called You Are a Badass. It is a private group just for the women of the company.
Yes.
And even though a lot of, our conversations are not work related, the fact that we laugh and share and kind of like collectively just experience different things that go on throughout our day, and like we have a place for us, it's just like that group feels like a place that I can go to, so that even if I had a more tactical like work type of question, it's like at the least there is a place for me, and that is at the just at the basic level, it's a sense of camaraderie, which we all need, like at a human basic level, to give us fulfillment and satisfaction at work.
I totally agree. And it means so much. You get the warm and fuzzies, but it also, I feel like it contributes to me being more productive and
Right.
motivated at work too. Like you said, there's a place for me here. I'm not an outsider. I can turn to folks. So, I feel like that's a big factor in me being happy at work, is just feeling that support. It's so simple.
Yeah. So, and you had mentioned this already in talking about maintaining inclusivity throughout the entire employee life cycle. So this partially would probably answer my next question, but like you said, diversity and inclusion are kind of buzzwords right now. and sometimes they're like photo ops. So how do we measure and stay accountable to this standard, and I guess this KPI, without kind of making it into a vanity metric? There are so many types of forms of diversity that aren't visible or image based or just obvious.
Yeah. One anecdotal thing comes to mind when thinking about photo ops and things like that. A lot of times there'll be executive sponsors for employee resource groups. And I always approach those types of situations with a bit of skepticism. But I want to give kudos to a sales leader at SurveyMonkey, John Schoenstein. We had a similar group to Gradient. It was called Latinos. So mostly aimed towards African American and Latino and general people of color. And John sat on that board, and I was like, wow, is he just sitting here because he's going to take a photo? But there were so many events where we sat and it wasn't recorded. Nobody knew he went, and he just engaged so fully. And seeing someone so high up dedicate their time to that, just on a personal level, like it really moved me to be like, this is really important to you. And it's not just when we have the t-shirts or it's a certain month or something like that. Like this is something you're really committed to. So on a peer-to-peer level, I found that really inspiring.
That totally reminded me of all the amazing male mentors and male coworkers that I've had throughout my career. And I don't think I've actually mentioned this on this podcast, on any series, but our Close IO CEO, Steli Afti, was the one who gave me the idea to do this series. And he's obviously a man. So it wasn't like, I had to make a case for doing this podcast. He literally handed this idea to me and said, this is a torch. I am giving it to you and run with it. And like it has really elevated me just on a level of feeling so valued here at this company. But also, it's given me so many opportunities to connect with other amazing women. So, definitely like kudos to all the people out there that are like supporting women or supporting diversity, and that just being off the record or off mic that you don't even see in a photo op or you don't hear, on the record.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing. And the person who connected us both is my manager, Tim Tyne, who just like, I didn't know this existed.
Right.
And just having that, I don't know, support from someone, it was so wonderful. And I've been at Help Scout for a couple of months now, and it just showed the level of commitment. So yeah, shout out to all of those people who are really supporting us there.
Yeah, in making sure that, we are staying accountable and we are not looking at this as just, oh, I mean, another thing that I've heard is like women talking about being asked to join a board because that founder is saying, oh, I have to find a female board. And like that person was like, oh yeah, that didn't like that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Would you say that it's kind of doing what we can to encourage people, and putting them into giving them opportunities and giving them that support, and then also just ensuring that once they are hired that we're getting feedback from them and they're actually happy with the resources that we're giving them, and it's not just like us being like, oh, this is a checkbox, it's checked off, and we forget all about it.
Yeah, that's exactly on the mark. And like nobody wants to be the checkbox or the token person in
Oh
the
my goodness.
photo,
Yeah.
like you know. And I think along with that, there are definitely tangible metrics that can be measured alongside that, but they have to be the right metrics. So there's a lot of talk of like, okay, we have this metric, we're an industry leader in diversity, but when you kind of drill down and kind of look at it, you're like, oh, they're looking at the company overall, and it's heavily engineers, but then they included other functions too to kind of bloat their metrics. So you get a false or like a distorted outcome, and kind of it's not significant at that point. So I think kind of digging into metrics, and so you mentioned like a board of directors, like they said, oh, we need to have one. That sounds like a token. But if you say we need a board of directors and we're going to measure it and cut it down by demographics, that's a different situation. So kind of thinking about those metrics more critically, and instead of being quick to pat ourselves on the back, I think being really critical about metrics is important.
Yeah, that's skeptical, like that skepticism, to guide you in making decisions and also how you then measure the outcomes of those decisions.
Yeah. Thinking about like I don't know, thinking about metrics like, okay, beyond what does our company, what is it made up about? Made up of, like who's who, like whatever. Everybody does that. But are we measuring promotion rates, and are we cutting those down by demographics? Kind of thinking out of the box a little bit, and thinking about, okay, these are things that we really need to measure and are going to mean something.
Is there anything that we haven't discussed so far, or a question that I haven't asked you yet that you'd like to leave our audience with?
You asked a lot of great questions. So I'm really glad you covered most of it. But just, I think for people to think beyond, like when they see the words diversity and inclusion, I hope that it's not something that people are like, oh, fatigued of talking about, or I've heard so much about it, like do they really mean it? If it's something, I think it's something everyone should be passionate about, no matter what your background is. And the best way to know if it's real is to get involved. And I found that anywhere I go, people are really, especially higher ups, they're really receptive to new ideas. So folks or companies sometimes don't know what they don't know. So don't be afraid to challenge, and say, I have a new idea, or I want to talk about diversity and inclusion, but it's not for a day. It's going to be an ongoing meeting we have every week, and being really serious there. So
Thank you
yeah,
so much for your insights, and thank you so much for being on the Close Eye Women in Sales series.
thank you for having me. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Hey, did you enjoy this episode? I'd love to hear your thoughts and suggestions. If you have questions that you'd like our guests to answer, or if you know of a woman in sales that we should feature, email me, Rebecca@close.io. That's with one B and two C's. And if you enjoyed this episode, got value out of it, got inspired, share it with a friend. There's a link in the description where you can also find show notes, and you can follow this series by subscribing to Close.io's YouTube channel, iTunes, SoundCloud, and various other podcast apps that you might already use. See you guys on the next one.